They told you evil would wear horns and hiss when it spoke. They told you it lived in forests, far from your home, far from your children, far from your Sunday dinners. But that was a lie. Evil doesn't wear horns. It wears lace. It walks with grace. It feeds the hungry and smiles when they thank it. And once you understand that, once the illusion is shattered, there is no returning to comfort. So listen carefully, because this is not just a story, it is a key. A key to a door most men don't dare open. In 1854, nestled in the swamp, choke belly of Louisiana, there was a town that didn't die when it should have. Cypress Hollow was surrounded by hunger, disease, and drought. The fields dried up, the animals disappeared, and the rivers shrank into mud and memory. Other towns withered into dust. But Cypress Hollow flourished. They ate well, they smiled. They thanked two sisters, Oli and Mabel Tobito, polite, refined, devout. They played piano in the evenings, prayed before every meal, and behind their cottage, smoke rose daily from a low, roofed structure with chained doors and blackened walls. They called it a smokehouse, but smoke doesn't just carry the scent of food. It carries memory. It carries consequence. And in that smoke was something the body recognized long before the mind would dare speak it. That scent, sweet, iron-rich, wrong, drew the town like moths to fire. The sisters gave meat freely. No coin was accepted. No questions were answered. They said it came from a cousin up north, trapper who sent salted pork in barrels. But no one ever saw these barrels. No one saw livestock either. Just the sisters, their fire, and the endless meals that tasted better than anything you've ever known. And when travelers passed through, strangers with names and stories and faces, they never left Cypress Hollow. They never left at all. The townspeople said they moved on, took the river, found work elsewhere, but no one checked. Because when hunger finds satisfaction, it stops looking, it stops thinking, it starts trusting. And trust, when weaponized, is more lethal than poison. You are not being told this for entertainment. You are being warned. You felt it too, haven't you? That feeling that something deeper, darker, older exists beneath our customs. Evil doesn't just hide, it serves. Welcome to the table. Take a seat. There's something you need to taste. The descent begins now. There's a reason people stop asking questions when they're fed well, not because they're full, but because they're grateful. And gratitude, when manipulated, becomes obedience. Cypress Hollow learned that the hard way. Every time the rains came and washed out the roads, every time the chickens died and the deer vanished from the woods, the townspeople still gathered for supper with full plates and bowed heads. The source didn't matter. The silence became sacred. It was Oli who walked among them most often. Tall, elegant, always dressed in pressed skirts and gloves despite the humidity. She greeted mothers with soft eyes, handed wrapped parcels to widows, offered steaming trays of ribs at the church steps. Her sister Mabel was quieter. She rarely left the property. Pale and soft-spoken, her apron always stained, her hair always tied in a red ribbon. She worked the fires behind the house. Some called her the quiet butcher. Others simply nodded and looked away when she passed. But there were signs. The smokehouse door had iron locks, chains. No one had ever been inside. On certain nights, when the fog rolled low and thick, people swore they heard something through the smoke. Not just crackling wood or bubbling fat, but voices. Cries, whimpers swallowed by fire. But by morning, the meat was on the table again, and the memory faded like a bad dream. And the town ate. They always ate, because the hunger in Cypress Hollow wasn't just in the stomach. It was in the soul. That desperate need to survive, to avoid pain, to believe in something good, even when the air smelled like blood and secrets. Father Henry was the first to feel it. The wrongness, the rot hidden beneath the lace and civility. He'd been sent from Baton Rouge to bring order back to the parish. Young, clean-eyed, full of scripture and optimism. But Cypress Hollow changed him. He watched the sisters, saw the smiles too practiced, the gestures too precise. He asked questions. Small ones at first. Where does the meat come from? How are the barrels delivered? No one answered directly. They'd shrug, murmur about cousins or luck, and change the subject. And when a trader vanished, cart still loaded, horse still tied, Henry knew something wasn't right. But what do you do when the whole town depends on a lie? When breaking the silence means tearing apart the one thing keeping everyone alive. Most men stay quiet. Most men eat. But Henry wasn't like most men. Not anymore. Father Henry began to understand something most men never dare admit, that evil rarely hides in darkness. It thrives in plain sight, draped in charity and the illusion of necessity. Cypress Hollow had become a town where silence was currency and denial a form of worship. Henry kept a journal, discreet and guarded, where he recorded every missing traveler, every oddity, every smile that lasted just a second too long. 6 names in 4 months. Men who arrived and were never seen again. Elijah Cole was the 7th, a hardened trader, sharp-eyed and fearless. Henry warned him with quiet urgency, don't eat their food, don't accept their kindness, just pass through. But Elijah laughed it off. Preacher, I've seen worse things in darker places. He was seen entering the Thibodeau cottage near dusk. By morning his horse remained, his cart untouched. But Elijah was gone. Henry asked around, the same hollow responses. Probably left early. Caught the river road. Lies spoken with eyes that didn't blink. That night, the smokehouse cuffed a thicker fog than usual. The air stung Henry's nose. Sweet, spicy, but with that same metallic hint. He opened the rectory window and gagged. It smelled like ham soaked in blood. He lit a candle, pressed a cloth to his face, and prayed for the soul of a man who never had a chance. The next day, Oli appeared at the church carrying a tray. Honeyed slices of meat wrapped in parchment. For the congregation, she said, the voice like warm syrup. Henry accepted it with a frozen smile. She stood there, graceful and unshaken, her hair pinned neatly, her gloves spotless. There was nothing to accuse. No proof, just the stench of suspicion and the burden of knowing. That night, Henry buried the tray behind the church garden with his bare hands. The wax paper clung to his fingers like skin. The ground welcomed the offering like it had before. And when he stood again, covered in dirt and shame, he realized the horror wasn't just in the sisters. It was in the soil, in the people, in him. Because every man in Cypress Hollow had eaten. Every child had licked their fingers clean. The truth wasn't a secret, it was a meal. And now it lived in their blood. Henry knew what came next would cost him everything. But he also knew this, you don't kill a demon by starving it. You kill it by dragging it into the light. The deeper Henry looked, the more he realized the town wasn't just complicit. It was enchanted. Not by magic, but by something older. Hunger. The kind of hunger that reshapes morality until a man forgets what he was. Hunger doesn't just live in the belly. It lives in the mind. It tells you to stop asking. It rewards silence with survival. And Cypress Hollow had survived by devouring its own doubts. Henry returned to the church and laid out the registry on the altar like a map of the dead. 7 names. 7 disappearances. None had a departure recorded, just arrivals. Temporary. Disposable. Travelers, outsiders, nameless souls with no roots in town, and no one to search for them. They vanished like ghosts and left behind nothing but fuller bellies and the rich scent of meat stewing in iron pots. It was all right there, written in silence. But the town had trained itself not to read between the lines. The people weren't blind. They were obedient. Because obedience keeps the stew hot, the fires lit, the nightmares at bay. And they feared hunger more than they feared hell. That night, Henry watched the village square from behind the heavy oak doors of the chapel. Maybelle crossed slowly with her basket, her blood-spotted apron catching the last of the dusk light. She placed a bundle of ribs on the community table, turned, and walked away. No words. Just a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Children squealed. Men clapped. Women called it a blessing. No one asked where it came from. Henry didn't join them. He sat in the dark, whispering to the crucifix around his neck. The next day, a boy vanished. Jacques Rowe, 10 years old, slipped away while his father slept off drink. Curious, clever, always asking questions. His father assumed he'd wandered off, maybe angry, maybe scared. But Henry knew better. Jack had asked him once about the smokehouse. Why it always burned. Why no one ever saw the animals. Henry had given him no answers. Now, there would be none left to give. The boy's satchel was found a day later, half buried in the mud behind the Tobito house. Inside it, a toy soldier, a slingshot, and a scrap of red, stained cloth. The sheriff waved it off. Could be anyone's, he muttered. Henry saw it for what it was, not a clue. A warning. A whisper that said, we are still feeding, and soon you will be next. The soul of a man doesn't break all at once. It splinters. First comes the doubt, then the denial, and finally, the silence. Father Henry felt every stage like a sickness growing beneath his skin. Jack's disappearance wasn't an accident. It wasn't a boy getting lost in the swamp. It was a message. And the people of Cypress Hollow had heard it, loud and clear, and chosen, again, not to listen. The town whispered explanations like lullabies, ran off. Boys do that. It's the fog. It plays tricks. But no one looked. No search parties. No weeping mothers at the edge of the woods. Only quiet prayers and a quick return to the table, because grief, like guilt, disrupts appetite. And the people here had grown too comfortable being fed. Henry confronted the father, a tired man with drink, stained lips and fists, too used to swinging. Did Jack say anything? He asked. The man hesitated, then nodded. He said he saw something behind the smokehouse. Something wrong. Said there was a man hanging upside down, skin peeled like a pig, bucket underneath. His voice cracked. I told him he was lying. Ord didn't answer. Henry didn't need to. The smokehouse chimney was already exhaling again, thick and smug. That night, Henry didn't sleep. He wandered the aisles of the chapel barefoot, the stone floor cold against his feet, whispering prayers that came out hollow. He lit every candle in the sanctuary, trying to chase away the fog pressing against the stained glass. He couldn't breathe, not because of the smoke, because of what it meant. That everyone knew. Deep down, they all knew, but knowing is different than admitting. And the moment you speak the truth out loud, it becomes yours. You own it. You carry it. And it marks you. So they didn't speak. They ate. And they smiled. And they clapped the sisters on the back for saving the town once again. The next morning, Henry stood in the square as Ali and Maybelle handed out bundles of smoked meat. Ali wore pale green gloves and a gentle smile. Maybelle hummed a lullaby, the same slow tune she always sang, soft and sweet like molasses boiling too long. May I speak with you? Henry asked, his voice steady but cold. Ali turned to him like porcelain. Of course, father. It's about the boy, he said. He's gone. A flicker passed through her eyes. Not fear, not guilt. Calculation. He was troubled, she replied. Some children just lose their way. Uli's voice was like silk soaked in poison. Calm, smooth, perfectly measured. We've always tried to be kind to the little ones, she said, brushing a speck of invisible dust from her dress. But some children invent stories. You know how they are. Henry watched her carefully, listening not to her words, but to the space between them. The stillness of Mabel beside her, the way the younger sister stared at the ground, her lips tight, her hands folded too neatly. Mabel never spoke. She didn't need to. Oli did the talking, the charming, the the weaving of words into blankets that smothered truth. Henry nodded and left, but he didn't believe a word of it. That afternoon, he found Jack Satchel caught in the reeds behind the smokehouse. Mud, slicked, half buried. Inside, a toy soldier carved from pine, a slingshot, and a strip of linen darkened with blood was evidence, but not proof. And in Cypress Hollow, without proof, a truth might as well be witchcraft. The sheriff dismissed it instantly. Boys leave things behind. Could have been anyone's. But Henry saw the truth in the way the sheriff wouldn't meet his eyes. They all knew. Everyone in that town knew. Some had tasted the stew and buried the suspicion. Others had accepted the lie like communion. But knowledge has a weight, and Henry felt it pulling him down, breath by breath. That night, he returned to the church with the satchel wrapped in cloth. He didn't report it. He buried it beneath the altar, a grave of silence to match the town's soul. But silence is never still for long, especially when it festers. The next morning, Henry broke into the Tobito home. He waited until the sisters left for the market. Baskets swinging, laughter floating through the swamp mist. Their absence was brief, but it was enough. The house was pristine, whitewashed walls, dried herbs hanging like trophies. A parlor so clean it felt staged, but it was the absence that spoke loudest. No bones, no scraps, no traps, no barrels of salted pork. Moved from room to room, checking floors, closets, behind curtains. It wasn't until he reached Maybelle's bedroom that he found it. The rocking chair with a loose floorboard, pried it open with the blade of his crucifix, and beneath the floor, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a single object. A leather-bound journal, slick with sweat, thick with dread, and inside it, the truth, not a confession, not guilt, just records, a butcher's log written in cursive. Henry opened the journal with hands that trembled more from recognition than fear. This wasn't a diary. It wasn't guilt bleeding out onto the page. It was clinical, cold, a ledger of lives rendered down to flavor and yield. Each name was followed by a date and a note. Details, measurements, valuations like entries in a recipe book. Amos Talbert, April 1847. Bitter too old, kept screaming. Hilda Ross, July 1849. Fat content ideal. Slight illness before, didn't matter. Josiah Pine, May 1850. Strong flavor, took longer to soften. Worth it. The further he read, the more the journal revealed. Not just what the sisters had done, but how long they'd been doing it. Years. Dozens of names. Some he recognized from town whispers. Others were strangers. Drifters, beggars, women who passed through and vanished. But the last entry stopped his breath cold. Jackalaw Row, September 1854. Curious, too lean but sweet and quiet. Didn't struggle much. The ink was still fresh, barely dry. Henry slammed the journal shut. The air in the room shifted, grew heavy like judgment. He tucked the book under his coat, replaced the floorboard, and left the house exactly as he'd found it. The walk back to the rectory felt like miles. Cypress Hollow's streets were empty, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was complicit. Every house, every window shuttered tight, seemed to whisper, "You know now." At the chapel, Henry locked the doors, lit every candle he had, and sat before the altar with the journal in his lap. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He just stared. The worst part wasn't the horror. It was the precision. The artistry. These weren't monsters acting on impulse. They were craftsmen, refining their methods, their tastes, their selections. Every death had been calculated. Every disappearance justified by quality, tenderness, availability. He thought of the town, how they chewed and laughed and praised the sisters, how they never questioned why the meat never ran out. He realized something darker than cannibalism. They didn't want to know. The town had made a silent covenant: feed us, and we won't ask where it came from. The sisters had simply honored it. Henry knew exposing this truth would be more than dangerous. It would be a betrayal to the town, to its survival, to the very illusion they had all agreed to uphold. But some truths don't ask permission. They burn through the skin of comfort like acid. And this one had already taken root. The next morning, Henry did something he hadn't done since arriving in Cypress Hollow. He sought out Reverend Arner. The former pastor had long since retired, a frail figure hidden behind dusty curtains and yellowed books, his mind half withered by time. But Henry needed confirmation. Needed to know if this rot was new or if it had always been there, festering under the skin of the town like a tumor no one dared name. Arner opened the door slowly, blinking against the light. His robe hung loose on his bones. "You look like you've seen the devil," he muttered. Henry handed him the journal, said nothing, just watched. The old man sat, opened it, and began to read. At first, his expression was flat, then pinched, then broken, and when he turned to a page near the middle, his lips parted, trembling. He touched the paper with 2 fingers as if confirming it was real. Then he whispered, "Tobias Arner, November 1838. That's my nephew." We thought he drowned. His eyes filled, not with tears, but with realization. "They've been doing this longer than I ever imagined," Henry said quietly. Arner said nothing more, closed the book, and handed it back with hands that shook. There was no protest, no denial, just defeat. And that was all Henry needed. He returned to the rectory and locked the journal away in a wine crate, wrapping it in cloth, burying it beneath the floorboards. He knew now that truth alone would not save Cypress Hollow. He needed revelation, exposure. He needed to burn their comfort to the ground, but the sisters were already a step ahead. The next morning, Henry found a package on the church doorstep, wrapped in wax paper, tied with a red ribbon. No note, just a small bone, white button resting on top, identical to the one Jack Larrow wore on his shirt the last day he was seen. Henry didn't open it. He didn't need to. He carried it without a word to the back garden, dug a hole beneath the fig tree, and set it ablaze. The smell rose thick and bitter, coating his tongue with something ancient and awful. That night, the smokehouse chimney poured out blackness, so thick it hung in the air like judgment, and for the first time, people looked up. Not for answers, but for permission, because deep down, they all knew what they'd traded. The question now wasn't what the sisters had done, was whether anyone still had the spine to stop them. Harvest came late that year in Cypress Hollow, and when it did, it brought more rot than yield. The corn twisted in the husks, stunted and gray, squash soared in the sun. Game was nowhere to be found. No deer, no wild pigs, not even birdsong in the trees. The swamp pulsed with silence, the kind that pressed on your chest when you tried to breathe. Still, the Tobito sisters prepared their annual feast. They always did. It was tradition, a celebration of survival. The last Sunday before the rains turned the roads to rivers and the land into soup, the entire town gathered behind the church under patchwork canopies and string-lit lanterns. Tables were lined with what little the people could offer: molasses jars, burnt biscuits, boiled roots. But the main course, as always, came from Oli and Mabel. This year it was stew. Thick, dark, fragrant, bubbling in black iron pots. Slices of golden potatoes floated in it, along with onions, herbs, and chunks of meat that melted on the tongue. Mabel ladled each bowl with care, lips curled into the faintest smile. Her eyes flicked upward with every serving, searching faces. Oli moved through the crowd like royalty, smiling, embracing, praising the community. And the people praised her back. They always had. Because it's easy to worship what feeds you, even if it feeds you pieces of yourself. Henry stood at the edge of it all, beneath the old oak tree, watching. He didn't eat. Not a bite. His stomach twisted with the weight of what he carried. He had proof. He had the journal. But that wasn't the challenge. The challenge was breaking through their hunger, their gratitude, their loyalty to the illusion. Because illusions are harder to kill than facts. Then it happened. A woman near the center of the gathering shrieked. Not in fear, but in confusion. She'd bitten into something hard. She spit it into her palm. A button, small, bone white, chipped at the edge. Henry's blood froze. He'd burned that exact button. He knew its shape, its weight. Others gathered around. That looks like one of Silas's. Someone whispered. Silas, the beggar who'd wandered into town 3 weeks ago, slept on the chapel steps, then vanished. That coat had those buttons. Another muttered. Oli stood still, bowl in hand, smiling. But Henry saw it, the flicker, the calculation. And so he stepped forward. Voice steady, cold. This is not beef, he said. And everything stopped. The laughter stopped. The fiddles fell silent. Spoons hovered halfway to mouths. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the bubbling of stew and the low rustle of the wind in the trees. Then Henry said it again. Louder this time. Heavier. This is not beef. A tremor moved through the crowd like a slow shiver. Some blinked, confused. Others looked down at their bowls. One man dropped his spoon. Another coughed into his hand, suddenly pale. Feather, Oli said, her voice honey sweet, stepping forward like a hostess insulted. Perhaps the heat's gotten to you. You haven't eaten and you look so tired. Sit, won't you? Rest. But Henry didn't move. He pulled the journal from his coat, held it aloft. I've seen your ledger, he said, voice sharp enough to cut through bone. I've read the names, the dates, the notes. He paused, letting the words fall like stones in a well. These aren't stories. These were people, children, travelers, men and women who came here for safety and were butchered for flavor. Maybelle still stood behind the cauldron, ladle in hand. Her face remained soft. Still, unbothered. Oli's smile dimmed, but only by degrees. These are dangerous accusations, she said gently. Cruel, even. Do you have proof of these things? Henry stepped forward and opened the book. Tobias Arner. November 1838. He was 10 years old. You said he was tender, didn't scream. He looked around. Reverend Arner remembers him. Thought he drowned. He didn't. Murmurs rippled now. Nervous glances. Shifting feet. One woman clutched her child closer. A man spit into the dirt. The crowd was fracturing, and the sisters knew it. Henry pressed the moment harder. How many of you have lost someone who passed through this town? A cousin who never arrived. A peddler who vanished on the road. How many of you have eaten their silence? He pointed to the smokehouse beyond the trees, its chimney still belching that slow, steady smoke. You've all seen it. You just chose not to see. Because they fed you. Because it was easier than facing what it cost. Oli's smile was gone now. Her eyes had gone sharp. You're very brave.
Father,
she said. But bravery often leads men into darkness they aren't ready to face. And denial, Henry replied, leads men straight to hell. The townspeople stood caught in the tension, eyes flicking between truth and comfort, between the priest and the pot. And in that suspended moment, something ancient shifted. The feast was over. What happens to a town when the veil lifts, when the lie they've cradled like a child finally opens its eyes and stares back? Cypress Hollow stood still, suspended between myth and reckoning. No one moved. No one breathed. The stew still bubbled in its pots, steam curling into the thick southern air, but now every scent was tainted. What had once smelled like comfort now reeked of blood and betrayal. A man near the front, a blacksmith, strong and silent, stepped back from the table. His bowl slipped from his hand and shattered on the packed dirt. Another woman gagged, stumbling toward the edge of the gathering, clutching her stomach. The silence didn't last. Whispers turned to mutters. Accusations crackled through the crowd like sparks hunting dry grass. How long? Someone rasped. Whose meat was that last year? Well, here's my brother. He passed through in spring. Henry saw it now, saw the slow awakening of a people who had been complicit too long. Guilt is a dangerous fuel. It burns hot. It demands a scapegoat. And the sisters, once saints, once angels, stood smiling no longer. Oli's expression had hardened into something ancient, something sharp. You ungrateful wretches, she hissed, her voice still elegant, but stripped of kindness. We fed you when God turned his face from this place. We gave when the earth dried up and the sky offered nothing but rot. You ate your fill, and now you dare spit in our faces. Mabel still said nothing. She only reached into the cauldron, slowly, and dipped her fingers into the stew. She brought them to her lips and licked them clean. Her eyes were locked on Henry, cold, hungry. You wanted miracles, Oli said, turning to the crowd. You prayed for salvation, and we gave it. You called it mercy. You called us holy. She raised her hands like a prophet at a burning altar. What is holiness but sacrifice? And what is sacrifice without flesh? The crowd recoiled. Mothers gathered their children. Men reached for knives they hadn't touched in years. The mask was gone now. The truth was breathing. We gave you life, Oli whispered. And now you'll feed us with your fear. Then Henry stepped forward, holding the journal like a relic. You fed us death, he said, loud enough for the swamp to hear. And now you'll answer for every bite. The townspeople began to close in, and for the first time, Uli Tobito looked afraid. Fear, when cornered, becomes something feral. Uli's composure cracked just long enough for the crowd to see what she truly was. Not a savior, not a martyr, but a predator. One who'd fed off the desperation of others for so long that she mistook obedience for worship. The people of Cypress Hollow, dizzy from the truth, surged forward with a kind of righteous confusion. Half fury, half grief. Because now, as they looked into the faces of the sisters, they saw the ghosts of every lie they'd swallowed with each meal. Henry didn't stop them. He simply stood still, the journal in hand, heart hammering like a war drum in his chest. And that's when Mabel moved. Quiet Mabel. Always the shadow, always the helper. She didn't scream, didn't run. She simply turned, ladle still in hand, and swung it in a wide archer. Boiling stew splashed across the blacksmith's face, and his scream cracked the evening in two. Chaos erupted. A woman fainted. A man tackled Uli to the ground. Another raised his fist to strike, but hesitated. Still poisoned by memory, by years of kindness, of dinners and gifts and warm words. Henry saw the confusion seize them mid-motion. It was working, the spell was breaking, but it still had claws. Oli struggled under the weight of three men, her voice a rasping snarl. You think you're pure, she spat. You all knew. You smelled it. You tasted it, and you begged for more. Mabel had vanished into the trees behind the smokehouse, and someone shouted, "She's running." But no one followed. Not yet, because they were still trapped in that liminal space between reckoning and justice. Henry turned to the man cradling his burned face, hands shaking. He placed the journal beside him, kneeling low. "She marked your name," he said. "You were next." The man choked back a sob, fingers curling into the dirt. Others began circling the smokehouse now. Its chimney still belched black clouds, as if unaware of the revolt at its feet. Henry followed them slowly, knowing what had to be done. "We open it," he said. "No." The people hesitated. A woman whispered, "No one ever opens the smokehouse." But someone had brought tools, crowbars, ropes, fire. The door, chained and nailed shut for decades, would open today. Because it had to. Because truth, once awakened, demands a body. And in Cypress Hollow, the smoke would finally speak. The chains groaned like something alive as the crowbar bit deep into rusted iron. It took 3 men to tear the smokehouse door from its frame. When it finally gave, it didn't creak. It screamed, the hinges shrieking like a dying thing. The townspeople recoiled as the door swung open and the thick, sweet smoke rolled out. Not white, not gray, but black, dense, and clinging like oil. It poured over them in waves, carrying with it the copper, sting of blood, the char of old bones, and something worse. Something that reeked of memory, of recognition. Henry stepped forward first. Inside, the darkness was almost solid. The smokehouse was deeper than it looked from outside, long and low like a throat. Hooks dangled from the ceiling, some swaying gently. Tables lined the walls, their wood darkened with time and with fluids. Jars filled with herbs and unnameable things stood in neat rows. But it was the far wall that drew Henry's breath short. There, beneath the largest hook, stood a stone slab, its surface stained and grooved, with rusted restraints bolted into the sides. Chains hung like vines from the rafters, some still slick. And on the floor, the dirt beneath the slab were bones. Small ones, piles of them, picked clean, arranged like trophies. "God forgive us," someone behind him whispered. "God wasn't here." Henry answered, voice like ice. People began to enter now, slowly, as if walking into a church of the damned. Mothers gasped. One man vomited. Another collapsed to his knees, weeping. They had eaten here, not in body, but in faith. Every meal was a communion, and this was their altar. A butcher's temple carved from lies. On the walls, someone had carved names. Hundreds of them. New dates. No explanations, just names, scratched deep into wood with fingernails, blades, maybe even teeth. Henry traced one with his fingers. Elijah Cole. He exhaled slowly. "Thee never left," he said. "Any of them." Behind him, the wind shifted. The smoke curled upward, sucked into the air like a soul escaping flesh. For the first time, Cypress Hollow saw its reflection. And it was monstrous. The people didn't cry out. They didn't scream. They understood. This was never about survival. It was about addiction. They hadn't been victims. They had been devotees. And now the God they'd fed with silence was bleeding in front of them. The door had opened. The truth had been butchered. And the reckoning had begun. There are things a town can bury for decades. Secrets, sins, bodies. But once unearthed, they rot fast. Cypress Hollow had split wide open, and the stench of truth was unbearable. Some ran from the smokehouse, clutching their stomachs, desperate to purge what they could no longer ignore. Others stood frozen, staring into the black chamber, as if it might pull them in, drag them down into the pit they'd helped dig. Henry stood among them, the journal clutched in one hand, his crucifix in the other, but he no longer felt like a priest. He felt like a gravekeeper, unlocking vaults better left sealed. Behind him, the stew still boiled in its iron pots, unattended. Flies swarmed. No one dared touch it now. The spell was broken, and with it, the sister's sanctuary. But Oli was still there. On her knees, wrists bound behind her by a belt, hair wild, face streaked with sweat and dirt. No longer elegant, no longer divine. Just flesh, just guilt bared and breathing. She said nothing. She didn't beg. Her eyes scanned the crowd like a queen stripped of her crown, searching for the last loyal subject. There were none. "We trusted you," someone whispered. A woman with sunburned skin and tears she couldn't explain. "You saved my child during the fever." Oli looked at her, lips parted, as if she might say it again. That old lie wrapped in mercy. "You were hungry. We helped." But no words came. The truth had gutted her, and the silence she'd once weaponized now turned on her like a blade. A man stepped forward, dragging a burning log from the communal fire. "Burn it," he said. "Burn the whole thing. Every wall." Others hesitated, not out of mercy, but because destruction means accountability. They burned the smokehouse. They'd erase the evidence. If they left it standing, they'd have to live with what it showed them. Henry raised his voice. "Let it stand." The people turned. "Let it stand," he repeated. "Let your children see it. Let them smell what was traded. Let them learn what happens when comfort is bought with blood." The man with the burning log paused, then let it fall. The flames hissed out in the dirt. No one moved. No one spoke. Then a voice, dry and hoarse, broke the silence. "Oli." "She's still out there," she rasped. "Mabel." The crowd turned toward the woods. The smokehouse wasn't empty. The town wasn't safe. The hunger wasn't finished. They say evil never dies. It adapts. When cornered, it slips through cracks, changes shape, hides in shadows until it's ready to feed again. And Mabel Tobito, the quiet one, the obedient sister with soft eyes and blood always under her fingernails, had vanished into the trees like smoke slipping from a dying flame. The town turned slowly toward the swamp's edge, toward the cypress trees standing in twisted rows like sentinels. No one moved. Not yet. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't denial. It was dread. Henry looked down at Oli. Her mouth bled where someone had struck her, but her eyes burned with something far more intact than her body. Faith. Not in salvation, but in inevitability. "You think this ends with me?" She whispered, and Henry saw it then. She wasn't afraid. Not of the fire. Not of the reckoning, because she believed Mabel would finish it. She was always the better one. Oli murmured, a crooked smile pulling at her lip. She knew how to wait. The crowd murmured behind him. People turned in circles, eyes scanning the tree line. No one wanted to admit it, but they feared Mabel more than they feared the truth. Because she had never spoken. She had never tried to justify. She simply cooked, carved, cleaned. She was the ritual made flesh. And now she was free. Somewhere in those woods, she was watching, listening. Henry stepped toward the edge of the gathering, eyes fixed on the fog curling low over the ground. "We hunt her," someone muttered. "We find her and end this." But Henry raised his hand. "No," he said. "You won't find her." A few villagers protested, desperate to cleanse the horror with action, but Henry shook his head. "You'll go into those woods and never come back. That place belongs to her now, and she's fed. She's strong." The priest turned back to the crowd, to the people still reeling from the revelation that their saviors were slaughterers, their feasts were funerals. "You can't kill what you still carry," he said coldly. "You want to destroy her, then starve what she left inside you." The people went still again. because they understood Mabel wasn't just hiding in the trees. She was hiding in them. In the cravings. In the silence. In every memory of that sweet, smoky meat they never questioned. The hunt wasn't out there. It was inward, and it had only just begun. That night, Cypress Hollow did not sleep. The fires were left burning, doors bolted, shutters nailed shut, not against wind or weather, but against memory. No one spoke above a whisper, and even then, only to ask the same question: what if she comes back? But Mabel didn't need to return in flesh. She already lingered in the marrow of every man who'd swallowed her meals. She lived now in the bite marks on their conscience, the stains in their dreams. Henry sat alone in the chapel, the journal open on the altar like scripture written by devils. He flipped through its final pages, studying the names, the comments, the surgical precision of each entry. Not a single one was written in haste. Every victim had been measured, observed, judged. The notes read like recipes crafted by obsession, and Mabel's hand was in them all. Where Oli had been the voice, Mabel had been the ritual. And Henry realized something chilling. Oli's capture had been a distraction, a sacrifice. Mabel had never panicked. She didn't scream or plead. She fled because she planned to. This had been rehearsed. The journal was not just a record. It was a blueprint, a lineage. Instructions to be followed, preserved, perfected. And Mabel had taken it into herself like sacrament. Somewhere in the swamp, she would begin again. Smaller, slower, smarter. All it would take was one hungry town. One willing silence. One man who needed help and never asked the cost. Henry closed the book and pressed his fingers to his temples. The town would never be whole again. It had seen too much. It had admitted too little. And guilt, once swallowed, becomes a parasite. Already some were trying to forget. Already a few whispered, "It wasn't all of us," or "We didn't know." But they did. Deep down, Cypress Hollow had chosen its salvation. One plate at a time. Henry knew the smokehouse would be boarded up, maybe torn down. But the hunger it fed, it would wait. He stood, walking slowly toward the chapel doors. Outside, fog moved through the town like a living thing. He whispered the truth to the night, hoping it might stick somewhere deeper than fear. "You're not innocent just because you regret it." Then he turned back, extinguished every candle, and sat in the dark. If Mabel came back, she would come as memory, as craving, and the town would be tempted to eat again. By morning, the smokehouse still stood, untouched by fire but scarred by revelation. No one approached it, not even the bravest. It had become a shrine to guilt, a tomb for appetite, a symbol that something far worse than starvation had once ruled Cypress Hollow. The townspeople avoided the square. The feasts were over. No stew, no ribs, no laughter. Only dry bread, weak broth, and shame that clung to the roof of the mouth like ash. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in brief, trembling fragments. "I remember the flavor. I gave it to my children. We thanked them." Henry listened but did not speak. He had become something else now. Not just a priest, but a keeper of reckoning. Carried the journal everywhere, not as evidence, but as penance. Its pages were no longer just records. They were scripture carved in blood. And with every name he reread, a part of him died, because he too had eaten. Maybe not much. A sliver here, a ceremonial bite there. He'd blessed meals not knowing what they were. But deep down, hadn't he suspected? Hadn't something in him recoiled from the sweetness of the meat? And hadn't he swallowed it anyway? Because that's what priests do in places like this. They keep the order. They quiet the panic. They feed the illusion. He looked out over his congregation that morning, and saw ghosts wearing human faces. Parents who had fed their children horror, elders who had praised Uli's generosity, men who had traded questions for seconds. No one was clean, and now the hunger wasn't just in the belly, it was in the soul. It gnawed from the inside, whispering that maybe it hadn't been so bad, that maybe survival justified the unthinkable, that maybe Mabel had only done what had to be done. Henry saw it growing in their eyes again. The rationalization. So, mid-sermon, he stopped, walked to the center of the church, looked each man in the eye and said, "If any of you would eat again, speak now." No one moved, but their silence wasn't protest. It was consideration. He saw it, felt it. Mabel had left the town, but she hadn't left them. She had become them. Quiet, patient, waiting. That's when Henry changed his tone, voice lower, colder. "Comment below, I see the smoke. I will not eat." Twice. Write it twice. Lock it into your blood. Because only those who speak the vow aloud ever escape the taste of denial. There are truths so bitter they stain the soul. Not because they're evil, but because once you know them, cannot return to the world as it was. Cypress Hollow was no longer a town. It was a ruin of ritual. And every man still breathing within it was a participant in that ritual, whether he held the knife or simply wiped his mouth. The smokehouse stood like a curse that couldn't be buried. They tried. The elders held a vote to tear it down, burn it, scatter its ashes in the swamp, but no one volunteered to swing the axe. No one wanted to be the one to open it again. So it remained, its iron hinges rusting, the chains still coiled at the base like sleeping snakes. The wind that passed through its cracks whistled like breath through teeth. Henry stood before it each morning, journal in hand, and waited. Not for Mabel to return, but for the town to choose, to decide what mattered more, memory or comfort. So far, comfort still had the upper hand. Whispers spread of men hiding dried meat in their cellars, swearing it was deer, hog, quirrell, anything but what it truly was. Denial is a disease that mutates. It becomes nostalgia. Then craving. One morning a boy was found in the woods behind the church. Barefoot, silent, eyes wide. He'd been gone for 2 days. When asked where he'd been, he only muttered, "She sang to me." Mabel. The town tried to hush it. Said he'd wandered off, imagined the voice, made up the song. But Henry knew better. He walked the tree line that night, stood beneath the hanging moss and listened. And far out beyond the reach of firelight, beyond the cypress grove, where the fog never lifted. Fertility. Slow, sweet. The same lullaby Mabel had always hummed while stirring the pot. It drifted through the branches like perfume. Henry didn't follow it. He just knelt, pressed his hand to the soil, whispered, "Not this time," and left an offering, a page torn from the journal, soaked in holy oil, lit by a trembling flame. The fire flared, sputtered, then died. The singing stopped, for now. Because Mabel wasn't dead. She was ritual incarnate, and rituals don't die, they return. Always, especially when the world is hungry again, especially when truth is too bitter to chew. And history, as you were never meant to know it, is still very much alive. You need to understand something now. Something they will never teach you in schools, never print in papers, never admit in polite company. Rituals aren't broken by exposure. They're broken by abstinence. Cypress Hollow didn't survive because of its faith or its luck. It survived because it fed its fear with flesh, and then called that miracle. The Thibodeau sisters were just the face of it. The blade, but the hunger, the real hunger, lived in the eyes of every man who knew and said nothing. And Mabel was the architect of that silence. Her power wasn't just in the smoke or the meat or the song. It was in her mastery of timing. She never spoke because she didn't need to. She understood something primal, that a well-fed man forgets where the meal came from. That mercy, when disguised as hospitality, will make a village kneel. That's why she didn't resist. That's why she ran. Not in fear, but in patience, because rituals don't fear the fire. They wait for it to die out. Henry watched the town each day. Men rebuilding fences, women sweeping porches, children playing again in the square, pretending things were normal. But their eyes gave them away. Still flinching at the scent of wood smoke, still looking over their shoulders at dusk. Still craving. The stew might be gone, but the memory wasn't. It sat on their tongues like a ghost that wouldn't leave. And Mabel knew it. Henry could feel her. She was still out there. Somewhere in the bayou, waiting for the town to fall quiet again, waiting for them to become hungry enough to listen. Because hunger is louder than guilt, louder than grief, louder than truth. And if you don't chain it, it will return to the table and ask to be served. Henry began carving names from the journal into stone, one by one, and planting them in the chapel garden. Not for mourning, but as a warning. A cemetery of silence. A graveyard of denial. Told the townspeople to kneel before it every week. Not to pray, but to remember. Some obeyed, most didn't. But the garden grew. More stones, more names, and still the swamp sang at night. Still, fog carried a voice. And somewhere in the moss, draped dark, Mabel waited. Like a forgotten god, patient, cruel, inevitable. Because if history teaches anything, it's this: when the world grows hungry enough, it will eat its monsters last. The most dangerous thing about evil is not its presence, but how useful it becomes when people are starving. Cypress Hollow had proven that. Tibito's sisters weren't saviors. They weren't even devils. They were necessary. That's what made them powerful. That's what still made Mabel dangerous. Henry saw the truth of it in every face he passed. Men who'd buried their guilt so deep it started to look like pride. Women who remembered the taste and secretly missed it. Children who had grown strong off meat they were never supposed to eat. And now, without it, they looked thin again. Pale, hollow, and the swamp seemed to know. Fog rolled in earlier, shadows lingered longer. The trees no longer whispered. They listened, and when the wind shifted just right, a scent would rise from the west woods. Not smoke, not meat, something sweeter. Memory. One boy followed it. 12 years old, son of a widow. He vanished during morning chores, barefoot, no tools, no supplies. Just gone. No one said it aloud, but every eye turned toward the tree line, toward the place where fog curled low and stayed too long. Henry gathered the town that evening under the chapel's bent steeple. He spoke plainly. If you go looking for her, you'll find her, but you won't come back the same. A voice from the crowd spat. Then we kill her. Burn her. And this. Henry looked at him, one of the few who'd taken second servings more than once, and replied, "You can't kill what you fed. She's not just out there, she's in here. And until you reckon with that, every step into that swamp makes you hers." The crowd didn't argue, but they didn't believe him either. Not fully. They were starting to forget again, and Mabel could feel it. Henry could sense her closer each night. The lullaby hummed just outside the chapel windows. Air smelled of roasted garlic and iron. It haunted dreams. Men woke salivating, fists clenched, afraid of what they'd asked for in their sleep. The hunger was returning, not for food, but for forgetting, because forgetting is the first course. Denial the second. And by the time the craving hits, it's already too late. Cypress Hollow was sick again. Not from famine, but from the memory of a feast. And Mabel was just waiting for the table to be set. Again. There comes a point in every man's life when he has to decide which version of himself to kill. The one who obeys, or the one who sees. Cypress Hollow had reached that threshold. But instead of rising, they looked down, hope-praying, starving in silence. They knew Mabel was out there. They just hoped she'd moved on, that maybe she'd find another town. Another people too desperate to ask questions. But predators don't leave fertile ground. And Cypress Hollow, wounded and ashamed, was exactly what she needed: weak, divided, hungry. Henry watched it unfold like rot spreading beneath floorboards. No panic. No riots. Just resignation. The boy who'd gone missing hadn't returned, but his mother began lighting candles at the edge of the woods, whispering lullabies into the trees. A butcher, once loud in his condemnation, quietly returned to his old tools. Sharpening blades, boiling bone for livestock, he claimed. But Henry saw the look in his eyes. The memory of precision. Others began gathering herbs again. Rosemary, sage, clove, claiming it was for medicine, but these were the same spices that used to mask sin in stew pots. Ritual doesn't die in fire. It hides in habit. Henry tried to fight it. He spoke from the pulpit, begged them to remember what they'd become. He read names from the journal every Sunday until his voice went raw. But guilt fades fast when it's not fed. The people wanted healing, but what they meant was forgetting. And forgetting is the invitation Mabel had been waiting for. One morning, a deer was found strung up on the old black oak. Its throat slit, its belly carved open, herbs stuffed inside the cavity like offering. But deer hadn't roamed this part of the swamp in months. Henry examined it closely. The cuts were deliberate, expert, surgical, a signature, and in the deer's mouth was a button. Bone white, smooth, clean. The same kind Jack Larrow had worn. The same kind Henry had burned. He held it in his palm like a brand, and he knew Mabel wasn't just signaling her return. She was testing the town, probing, waiting to see who'd answer, who still remembered the flavor, who was still willing to eat. Cypress Hollow had not been spared. It had been marked. And unless the people bled this thing from their roots, they'd eat again. And this time, they'd know exactly what they were chewing. That night, the smoke returned. Not from the chimney of the old Tobito house, but from somewhere deeper, hidden among the trees where the ground stays wet and the stars refuse to shine. It drifted into town slow and thick, curling through doorways and under shutters like something alive. It didn't smell like pine or oak. It smelled like meat, seasoned, sweet, and unmistakable. The scent wrapped around the throat like a memory, one that begged not to be resisted. Men opened their doors and stood in silence, nostrils flared, not speaking, not daring to look one another in the eye. Because they recognized it. They all did. Mabel was cooking again. And none of them were sure if they were being warned or invited. Henry didn't wait. He walked through the center of town with his coat unbuttoned, crucifix swinging from his neck, and the journal held tightly beneath his arm. The garden of stones behind the chapel, once a monument, had become overgrown, forgotten. He knelt among the weeds, brushing moss from the names, and whispered the old vow again. I see the smoke. I will not eat. Twice, like he'd told the others. But the words felt thinner now, the silence around him thicker. The town had begun to slip again, deeper than before, not because they were deceived, but because they had tasted the truth and found it delicious. That was the worst part, the honest part. They liked it. Not just the food, the secrecy, power of knowing and still choosing, the thrill of consuming what others wouldn't dare. Mabel hadn't fed them horror. She had fed them their own shadow. And now, they were starting to crave it again. Henry walked to the smokehouse before dawn. The door still stood, sealed tight, but something was different. Scratched into the wood, where the hinges groaned, was a single phrasing. Still hungry. Not signed, not needed. It was her. She had returned. Not with fire or fury, but with appetite. And that's how it always begins. Not with murder, but with permission. With one man deciding to taste, just once. With one woman deciding to let the pot simmer a little longer. And then another. And another. Until the stew is full. Until the town forgets again. Mabel didn't need to kill Cypress Hollow. She just needed it to remember what it missed. And as the smoke thickened, Henry feared it already had. The sickness creeping back into Cypress Hollow didn't look like plague or famine. It looked like comfort, familiarity, like men rebuilding old smoke racks in their yards, just in case. Like women boiling onions and garlic together to ward off the chill. But Henry saw it for what it was. Ritual memory, hunger rehearsing its lines. The feast hadn't resumed, not publicly. But beneath the surface, the town was setting the table again. And Mabel. She was patient. She didn't need to rush, because the longer they starved, the more they'd convince themselves that the last time wasn't so bad. That the cost had been worth the warmth, the flavor, the full billies and quiet nights. That maybe, just maybe, the horror had only been in hindsight. This is how darkness reclaims its place. Not through conquest, but invitation. Henry tried to intervene. He went house to house, warning them. He showed them the journal. Read aloud the most brutal entries. Baby G, January 1851. Would not stop crying, waste of brine. But people flinched more at the words than the meaning. They didn't want the truth. They wanted peace. And peace meant forgetting. We're not eating anything like that. One man said, eyes darting, we're just surviving. But Henry saw the cured meat hanging in his cellar, smelled the smoke in the rafters. Where did it come from? He asked. The man hesitated, then lied. Badly was starting again. The townspeople weren't afraid of Mabel. They were preparing for her. Not to fight her, to receive her. That night, Henry found a new object on the chapel steps. A folded piece of linen tied with black string. Inside a small bone-handled knife. Clean, sharp, and carved into the blade was a single word, yours. He dropped it like it burned. It wasn't a threat. It was an offering, a way back. An invitation to lead them, not out, but in. Because Mabel didn't need to be the cook this time. She just needed Henry to become the priest of the table. A new high servant, one who would bless the meat, forgive the guilt, and let the town feast without fear. She was testing him, tempting him. And the worst part? He understood, not agreed, not accepted, but understood. Because when you see people choosing the lie over the truth again and again, it makes you wonder if the lie is the only thing that ever fed them at all. By the end of that week, Cypress Hollow had become something worse than damned. It had become quiet. Not the silence of peace, but of complicity. The kind of quiet that creeps in when everyone knows what's happening, but no one wants to be the first to admit they've already agreed to it. Fires burned low behind shuttered windows. Smoke curled up in thin gray wisps from backyards that once swore they'd never burn meat again. And inside, families whispered with full mouths and eyes that didn't dare meet. It hadn't taken long. Hunger is a slow poison, but memory is faster. The memory of what Mabel's meals did for the town. The strength, the warmth, the unity was like perfume to a starving dog. All she had to do was return the scent. A single cut of meat, a single voice in the fog, a single offering left at the right doorstep, and the ritual had begun again. Quiet, polite, civilized. Henry watched it unfold from the chapel steps like a man watching his own funeral. The people didn't shun him. They greeted him with polite smiles. They bowed their heads when he passed, but none of them asked for sermons anymore. None of them visited the chapel garden. The stones were growing moss again. One night, a woman knocked at his door. Young, newly widowed. She looked pale, shaken. "I haven't eaten in 2 days," she said. "Can't stop smelling it. I dream of it. It calls to me." Henry let her inside, gave her dry bread, water, read scripture over her until her hands stopped shaking. But when he offered her the cot to sleep, she asked him a question that split him in two. "Do you still have the knife?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her eyes already knew, because Mabel had planted that seed in him the night she left the knife. Not with force, but with recognition. She knew what the town didn't, that Henry's strength came not from holiness, but from knowledge. And knowledge, when cornered, becomes choice. He hadn't eaten, but he'd considered. That was enough. The line had been crossed, and once you taste the power of knowing what others deny, you either burn the truth or serve it. That night, he held the knife in his hand, staring at it for hours. Not because he wanted to use it, but because he needed to remember what it felt like. That weight, that invitation, that ancient question carved into the bone. How far would you go to never be hungry again? There is a moment every man faces, often alone and often too late, when he realizes he's no longer choosing between right and wrong, but between two kinds of damnation. Henry sat in the chapel, bone, handled knife resting across his lap like a relic of something ancient, sacred, profane. It wasn't stained. It wasn't cursed. It was offered. And that's what made it terrifying. It meant Mabel didn't need to return to the town in flesh. She only needed to awaken the choice in others. Let them ask for her. Let them crave her without admitting it. The knife was only a key. The hunger was already inside them. Cypress Hollow, for all its talk of redemption, was slipping again. No blood had spilled yet. No bodies had disappeared, but Henry could feel it like a storm building beneath the skin. The way people paused near the smokehouse ruins. The way they glanced at each other during supper. The way they asked vague questions. Did you hear anything last night? Was that music? Do you think she'd come back if we begged? Mabel didn't need a smokehouse anymore. She'd become one. She lived in the cravings, the questions, the low murmur of longing that passed between villagers when the air got heavy and the food ran thin. Henry tried to preach. He called for fasts, penance, cleansing, but no one came. The pews were empty now. The chapel cold. The fig tree behind the altar had begun to rot from the roots up, sickened, perhaps, by the offerings buried beneath it. That night, Henry heard music, not loud, not joyful, just a soft, humming lullaby drifting on the breeze through the chapel window. The same tune Mabel had always hummed while stirring the stew. Slow, sweet, and cruel in its innocence. He stood, stepped into the aisle, walked barefoot out into the fog. He didn't bring the knife. He didn't need it. The melody pulled him like a thread through the ribs. He moved past the chapel, through the square, past the Tobido house, still standing, still sealed, and toward the swamp. The trees opened for him. The air grew colder. The fog thickened. And in the distance, he saw a small flame flickering in the dark, not a bonfire, a lantern, Beside it a woman, pale, still, Mabel, waiting. Not chasing, not hunting. Waiting. And Henry stopped because he knew. Whatever happened next wouldn't be a confrontation. It would be a decision. She stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, one hand at her side, other cradling the lantern like it held something holy. Mabel Tobito didn't move, didn't blink. Her red ribbon still clung to a braid falling over her shoulder, and her apron, though clean, hung heavy as if soaked with ghosts. Henry froze, not because he feared her, but because he recognized her. Not as a murderer, not even as a monster, but as a mirror. She hadn't come to kill him, she had come to watch him choose. That was always her gift. Never the knife, never the fire, but the ability to stand silently at the crossroads and let others walk willingly into darkness. The lantern cast her face in a soft glow, and in that moment, she looked almost childlike. Fragile. But the air around her pulsed with something older than rage. It smelled like bone broth and time, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't threatening. It was tender. "You're thinner," she said. Henry said nothing. "They're starving," she added. "Even the ones who pretend they aren't. I smell it on them." Her eyes flicked toward the sky, where clouds hung low and swollen. "The rains are coming. The river will rise. They'll lose the root cellars. The corn's already gone. And when the deer don't return, they'll come looking. Not for me. For what I offered." She stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "They'll come to you, Father. You know they will." Henry's fingers clenched. "I won't serve them." Mabel tilted her head. "You already are. You speak for the past. You carry their guilt. That's a kind of feeding, isn't it?" He wanted to deny it, wanted to shout, but he couldn't, because she wasn't wrong. Every sermon, every warning, every time he reminded the people of what they'd done, he was feeding the ritual in reverse, keeping it alive through guilt instead of meat. And Mabel smiled because she could see the fracture. "I brought you something," she said. From behind the lantern, she lifted a cloth bundle and placed it on a low stump between them. No tricks, no blood, just bread, made the old way. Before the meat, before the smoke. Henry stared at it. "You think I'll take it?" "No," she said softly. "I think you'll need it." The rain began to fall in thin, cold sheets. The trees swayed, and the priest, soaked and shaking, stared at the bundle like it held the future of everything. The bundle sat there like a final test, innocent in form, ancient in meaning. Henry didn't move. The rain slithered down his face. The cloth darkened slowly, soaking through. "Inside was bread," she said. But the truth was never in the ingredients. It was in the offering, in the moment. Mabel hadn't brought it as a gesture of peace. She brought it to ask one question without speaking. What would you choose when no one is watching? Henry looked at her, standing motionless beneath the trees, her face unreadable. This wasn't seduction, it was inheritance. "If you take it," she said, "I'll go. You'll never see me again." Her voice was soft, but the air tightened around it. "They'll come to you when the next child disappears. They'll come begging when the crops rot again. And they'll remember this night. They'll remember you standing here choosing to keep them pure or fed." Henry stepped forward once, slow, deliberate, his eyes locked on hers. "And if I refuse?" Mabel didn't blink. "Then you'll bury more children. And eventually, someone else will light the fire." The words didn't land like threats. They landed like prophecy. He understood now. Mabel was never the disease. She was the expression of it. A manifestation of what people beg for when truth is too hard to chew. And Cypress Hollow had always been hungry. The sisters hadn't cursed the town. The town had summoned them. Ollie with her grace, Mabel with her silence. They were answers made flesh. And now, with Ollie gone, Mabel had returned not to conquer, but to remind. Henry knelt before the bundle. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He looked down and whispered to the mud, "I see the smoke. I will not eat." Once. Then again, his lips trembled the second time. Not from doubt, but from H. The H of knowing this vow would be tested again and again until it shattered or killed him. Mabel exhaled. Just once. No anger, no disappointment. She stepped backward into the trees. The fog swallowed her, and the lantern blinked out like a star drowning in swamp water. And then, she was gone. Henry stood alone, the bundle untouched. Rain eased. The woods fell silent. But he knew the ritual hadn't ended. It had evolved. Because now the hunger wasn't in the town. It was in him. And no one is strong forever. The next morning, bundle was still there. Damp, cold, silent. Henry stared at it from the chapel window like a man watching a loaded pistol on his doorstep. He hadn't touched it. Not yet, but its presence did something worse than temptation. It waited. And waiting is how hunger wins. It doesn't need to attack. It just needs to outlast your discipline. Cypress Hollow had begun to stir again, slowly shaking off the fear, the shame, the memory of what they'd seen. The smokehouse remained locked, but the whispers had returned. The rains are late. The children won't stop crying. There's nothing left to hunt. And beneath each of those truths was the same unspoken sentence through. We need her. Mabel's song hadn't been heard again. Her figure hadn't reappeared. But she didn't need to haunt them in flesh. She haunted their cravings. She lived in the way they looked at their empty plates, the way their prayers began to trail off into silence. Not silence of reverence, but of resentment. Because prayers don't fill bellies, and guilt doesn't cure hunger. A young man approached Henry near dusk, one of the blacksmith's sons. Then now, eyes sunken. "There's something we need," he said, and the way he said we chilled Henry to the marrow. "We're not asking to sin," the boy added. "We just want to live. Just a little help. One more season. One more feast. Then we'll repent." Henry didn't answer. Because he'd heard it before. That was the lie the town always told itself before it opened its mouth again. Just one more bite. Just one more body. And Mabel would be waiting. Always. Because she wasn't a person anymore. She was a cycle, practice. A poison sweetened into ritual. Henry walked to the bundle again before dark, and this time he picked it up. Slowly, carefully, inside just as she said. Bread. Dense, heavy. Fragrant. But there was something else folded into the linen. A note, written that same clean, curved hand. Just 3 words. You already did. Henry stood frozen. Because she was right. He had eaten, long ago, a sliver of meat during a blessing. A spoonful at a christening. A taste at the edge of someone else's lie. And now the truth rotted in his stomach like a seed. Cypress Hollow was not his to save. It never had been. It was his to witness. And witnessing is the most painful kind of damnation. By the time the first storm finally broke over Cypress Hollow, the people had already begun to forget what they had vowed to remember. The rain washed clean the dirt paths, the rotted roots, even the dried blood on old chopping blocks. But it could not wash out what they had tasted. That flavor, smoke, iron, salt, something else, lingered in the memory like a perfume worn too close to the skin. Henry watched from the chapel window as men done patched roofs and women hung laundry beneath gray skies, pretending they were healed, that the past had burned clean. But healing without repentance is just infection buried deeper. He knew that. And so did Mabel. She didn't return, not in form. She didn't need to. Her presence was now carried by those who'd once sworn her off and now dreamt of her cooking. The butcher opened his shop again. Just game, he promised. But Henry saw him slipping into the woods at night, alone, hands empty and eyes glazed. A family moved into the Tobito cottage, against warnings, against reason. "It's just a house," they said. "We need shelter." But Henry watched their chimney begin to smoke within days, a thin gray thread rising just like before. No one spoke of the journal anymore. The chapel grew colder, empty, forgotten. Even the garden of stones behind it lay unvisited. The names carved into them, names of the eaten, the vanished, faded under moss and rain. It was happening again, but slower this time, quieter. That was Mabel's genius. She knew the town would never go back to open feasting. That era was over. Now she would live in the small things, the compromises, the secrets, the bargains made at dusk when no one was looking. One bite at a time. One lie swallowed whole. Henry sat in the chapel pews at night, the bread untouched, the knife sealed in a drawer beneath the altar. But even he could feel it creeping in. Not in his flesh, but in his fatigue. The exhaustion of standing against a tide that only ever rises. He no longer asked, "When will they eat again?" He asked, "When will I?" Because even the watchman, even the priest, even the one who shouts in the dark until his voice is gone, eventually he hungers too. And in Cypress Hollow, hunger isn't weakness. It's prophecy. And prophecy, once fed, always finds a way back to the fire. The wind howled through Cypress Hollow like something that remembered. It rushed through the cypress branches, over the chapel roof, and down into the smokehouse chimney, now long cold but never truly silent. The town had gone still again. Not peaceful, not innocent, just still. A stillness that meant surrender. Henry stood in the chapel doorway, watching the fog roll in, thick and low, swallowing fences and footsteps alike. He'd spent months trying to save them, screaming into silence, carving names into stone like spells, carrying guilt like a cross he never asked for. But Cypress Hollow was never meant to be saved. It was meant to feed. That's why it survived when others starved, why it flourished in drought, why it welcomed monsters in skirts and aprons and called them saints. Oli was the blade, but Mabel was the seed, and they had planted her deep. Not in the woods, not in the smokehouse, but in the hearts of the people. And hearts, when hungry, will turn on anything. Truth, faith, even their own. Henry felt it in himself too. He hadn't touched the bread, but he'd considered. He'd dreamed. He'd woken with the scent of spice in his throat, his hands curled like claws around the phantom weight of a ladle. It wasn't possession. It was memory, carried through communion, passed through generations. In Cypress Hollow, hunger was never just hunger. It was inheritance. He stepped out into the night, wind whipping his coat. In his pocket, the note remained, "You already did." And now he understood. This wasn't Mabel taunting him. It was her welcoming him. He was part of it now. The moment he stayed silent. The moment he buried the first truth instead of burning it. The moment he served the sacrament knowing it was sin. That's how it begins. Not with the butcher's hook, but with a priest's blessing. He looked back at the chapel, then to the distant woods where a faint lantern flickered once, then vanished. Mabel would return, not with a knife, but with need. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not this year. But eventually, when the crops fail, when the deer don't come, when the bellies gnaw with quiet rage, she will be called back, not by smoke, by invitation. And someone will answer. Someone always does. That is the truth Cypress Hollow tried to bury. And that is the truth you were never meant to hear. But now you have. So ask yourself, when the hunger comes, what will you eat?